Ashtotarashata Shri Srimad His Divine Grace Srila A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada Ki Jai. Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda Ki Jai. All glories to the assembled devotees. Hare Krishna. All glories to the assembled devotees. Hare Krishna. All glories to the assembled devotees. Hare Krishna. All glories to Sri Guru and Sri Gaura. So, Hare Krishna everyone. So this morning, Sunday mornings usually, we read from Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita. And I heard that the theme of this retreat was Srila Prabhupada and the magic of Krishna. So I thought, what better way to honor that theme than to stick with our regular reading of Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita. And no doubt plenty of Srila Prabhupada's magic and the magic of Krishna will pop out to us. So, I'll just go ahead and begin with invocation as usual. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. 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 Okay, so at this section in the Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita, correct me if I'm wrong, if anybody who's been regularly following, but it seems like this is coming to the end of Srila Prabhupada's first visit to San Francisco. The devotees there, brand new devotees, under Srila Prabhupada's inspiration and instruction, they started a center in San Francisco, and before that there was only the storefront in New York City. So we're still at the very beginning of the Hare Krishna movement unfolding in the US here.
Just say the volume and the chapter, like where we are.
Okay.
So that everybody...
Okay, so in the Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita, if anybody would like to follow along on their phones. So the name of the chapter, it's chapter 24, entitled New Jagannath Puri.
Volume 1.
Yes, this is volume 1. In chapter 24, New Jagannath Puri. And so as I said, we're just coming to the end of Prabhupada's visit. It's a 2-month visit in San Francisco. And so this section is going to take us through various programs that Prabhupada is doing that the devotees there have lined up for him. Okay. Sitting on a bridge table in the student lounge, chanting into a little microphone while his followers played their instruments, Prabhupada began the kirtan at Stanford University. At first there were about 20 students, but gradually, sorry, I'm going to adjust the microphone so that I can see the book that I'm reading. There we go. That's better. So at first there were about 20 students, but gradually more entered the lounge and gathered around. Everyone was chanting. Then suddenly the lounge became transformed as more than 200 Stanford students, most of them completely new to the Hare Krishna mantra, danced and chanted with as much enthusiasm as the most uninhibited hate-ashbury crowd. Prabhupada led the kirtan for more than an hour. In this talk afterwards, he explained what they had all just experienced. This is Prabhupada speaking. This Hare Krishna dance is the best process for getting out of this illusion that I am this body. Our society is trying to distribute to the world the priceless gift of the Lord. You did not understand the words, but you still felt the ecstasy to dance. End quote. Prabhupada took questions from the audience. everything proceeded in the standard fashion until someone asked whether college students should respond to the military draft. Prabhupada replied that since they had elected their own government, there was no use complaining if the government told them to go to war. But some of the students, the same students who had chanted and danced only minutes before, began to shout, "No, no!" Prabhupada tried explaining his point, but they raised their voices in anger until the hall became a bedlam of shouting. Finally, Srila Prabhupada picked up his kartals and began chanting again, and the dissenters left. The next day, the Palo Alto Times ran a front page story with the headlines and a photo of the kirtan. So the headline of the article is, "Ancient Trance Dance Features Swami's Visit to Stanford." And here's an excerpt from that column. "Hold on there a minute, all you with it people. There's a new dance about to sweep the country. It's called the Swami. It's going to replace the frog, watusi, swim, and even the good old barn stomp. Why? Because you can do any old step to it, and at the same time find real happiness. You can rid yourself of the illusion that you and your body are inseparable." The chant started quietly, but gained volume as more people joined in. After half an hour, a long-haired youth with 3 strings of red beads around his neck stood up and began to dance to the music. He closed his eyes in ecstasy and held his hands palm up, shoulder high. 2 girls soon followed him. One had a string of bells around her neck. A bearded fellow with a fluorescent pink skull cap joined in, still beating on his tambourine. The Swami cut in a microphone in front of him, and the added volume provoked others to chant and stomp more loudly. A pretty girl in a sari danced, as if in a hypnotic trance. A short, dark man, neatly dressed in suit and tie, threw off his shoes and joined in. A young math professor did likewise. A pretty blonde 3-year-old girl rocked and swayed in one corner. Suddenly, most of the audience was dancing and chanting. The pace grew faster and faster. Faces streamed with sweat. The temperature soared. Then it all stopped. And that's the end of the article. Srila Prabhupada was pleased with the article and asked for some photocopies of it. "What are they calling the dance?" he laughed. "The Swami?" Across the top of the kirtan photo, he typed, "Everyone joins in complete ecstasy when Swami Bhaktivedanta chants his hypnotic Hare Krishna." The devotees got Prabhupada an engagement at a YMCA, where the audience consisted almost entirely of children. The devotees had decorated the hall with posters of Krishna and had hung a big sign with the Maha Mantra on it. The children chanted along with Prabhupada during kirtan. Just before the lecture, Guru Das reminded him, maybe the talk should be simple, since they are all between 9 and 14 years old. Prabhupada nodded silently. Then Prabhupada began to speak. "Is there a student here who is intelligent?" No one responded. After a moment, a 12-year-old boy, urged by his teachers and fellow students, raised his hand. Prabhupada motioned for him to come forward. The boy wore thick glasses, short pants, and a blazer, and his hair was combed back very neatly. Pointing to the boy's head, Prabhupada said, "What is that?" The boy almost scoffed at the simpleness of the question. "My head." Prabhupada then pointed to the boy's arm and said quietly, "What is that?" "My arm," the boy said. Prabhupada then pointed to the boy's foot. "What is that?" "My foot," the boy answered, still looking incredulous. "Yes," Srila Prabhupada said, "you say, this is my head, my arm, my foot, my body, but what are you?" The boy stood perplexed, unable to answer Prabhupada's simple question. "We say my hand," Srila Prabhupada continued, "but who is the owner of my hand?" We say my hand, so that means someone owns my hand. But where does the owner live? I do not say I hand, I say my hand. So my hand and I are different. I am within my body, and you are within your body. But I am not my body, and you are not your body. We are different from the body. Real intelligence means to know who I am. Haight-Ashbury's psychedelic shop, a popular hippie gathering place, had extended to Prabhupada many invitations to come and speak. After the mantra rock dance, the hippies there had put a sign in the window, a night of consciousness. Also in response to the mantra rock dance, they had opened a meditation room in the rear of their store. But since the hippies at the psychedelic shop were almost always intoxicated, Prabhupada's followers had said that it would not be a good idea for Prabhupada to go. But the hippies kept entreating. Finally, the devotees relented, advising Prabhupada it might be all right for him to go. So one Saturday night, Prabhupada and two devotees walked over to Haight Street, to this psychedelic shop. Young people crowded the streets, hippies sitting along the sidewalk, selling hashish pipes and other dope paraphernalia, homosexuals, wildly costumed hippies with painted faces, small groups smoking marijuana, drinking, singing, and playing guitars, a typical evening on Haight Street. At the psychedelic shop, marijuana and tobacco smoke hung heavy in the air, mingling with the smell of alcohol and bodies. Prabhupada entered the meditation room, its ceiling and walls covered with madrasas, and sat down. The room was full of hippies, many lying down, heavily intoxicated, looking up at him with half-closed eyes. He spoke in a low voice, but his presence somehow held their attention. Although lethargic, the group was appreciative, and after Prabhupada had finished, those who were still conscious expressed their approval. On Saturday, April 1st, near the end of his stay in San Francisco, Prabhupada accepted an invitation from Lou Gottlieb, head of the Morning Star Ranch, a nudist hippie colony. Morning Star was a bunch of young people living in the woods. The devotees explained to Prabhupada. The hippies there had spiritual aspirations. They grew vegetables and worshipped the sun. They would hold hands and listen to the air. And naturally, they were involved in lots of drug taking and free sex. When Lou came in the morning to pick up the Swami, they talked, and Prabhupada gave him a rasagula, a sweet made of bite-sized balls of curd, simmered in sugar butter. After a few minutes together in Prabhupada's room, they started for Morning Star, 60 miles north of San Francisco. Lou Gottlieb, so this is Lou Gottlieb himself speaking. I told Swamiji to fasten his seatbelt. He said no. He said Krishna will handle it or something. So on the way out, I was showing off all my vast erudition in having read a biography of Ramakrishna. That's when Bhaktivedanta gave the best advice to the aspirant I ever heard. We were talking about Ramakrishna and Vivekananda and Aurobindo and this and that. So he said, you know, putting a gentle hand on my knee, when you have found your true path, all further investigation of comparative religion is merely sense enjoyment. Situated in a forest of redwoods, more than 200 feet tall, Morning Star Ranch occupied what had once been an egg farm. Some of the land had been cleared for farming. There were a few tents, some unsubstantial little huts, a couple of tree houses, but the only decent, insulated building was Lou's place, an old chicken house. The commune had about 100 full-time members, with the number of residents rising to as many as 300 on the weekends in warm weather, when people would come out to work in the garden or just walk around naked and get high. Prabhupada arrived at 1 in the afternoon on a beautiful sunny day. He first wanted to rest, so Lu offered his own house. Walking to Lu's place, Prabhupada noticed a few nude men and women hoeing in the garden. One of the workers, a short, stocky young man, Herbie Bresak, stopped his work in the garden and came to greet the Swami. Herbie says, Lu Gottlieb introduced us. We were planting potatoes at the time. He said, "This is Bhaktivedanta Swami." I came out of the garden and shook Swamiji's hand. I said, "Hello, Swami." He asked me, "What are you doing?" I told him that I was just planting potatoes. He then asked me what I was doing with my life. I didn't answer. End quote. After resting for a few minutes, Prabhupada was ready for the kirtan. He and Lu went to a hilly pasture where the hippies had placed a wooden seat for Prabhupada before a bower of wild flowers arranged like a bandshell. Prabhupada took his seat and began chanting. The commune members, all of whom had been anticipating the Swami's visit, gathered eagerly for the group meditation. And someone named Mike Morrissey, he speaks, some people had clothes on, some people didn't. Some were dancing around. But Swamiji wasn't looking at our bodies. He was looking at our souls and giving us the mercy we needed. End quote. The kirtan was well received. One of the members of the commune was so enthralled by the kirtan that he decided to put on his clothes and go back to San Francisco with the Swami. Prabhupada spoke very briefly, and then he prepared to leave, shaking hands and exchanging courtesies as he walked to the car. Although Srila Prabhupada hadn't spoken much philosophy, his kirtan left a deep impression on the hippies at Morning Star. While leaving, he had told one of the young men, "Keep chanting this Hare Krishna mantra here." And they did. Now Lu Gottlieb speaks. The Swami was an extremely intelligent guy with a job to do. There was no sanctimony or holy pretension. None of that eyes lifted silently to the sky. All I remember is just a very pleasant, incredibly safe feeling. There's no doubt that the Maha Mantra, once you get the mantra into the head, it's there. It never stops. It's in the cells. It awakens the DNA or something. Shortly thereafter, half of the people at Morning Star got seriously into chanting. Those that did were extremely sincere God-seekers. Their aspiration was 1,000% sincere, considering the circumstances in which they were found. They were all dopers, that's for sure, but they definitely gave that up once they got in touch with the Maha Mantra. His top cloth wrapped loosely around his shoulders, Prabhupada stood a last moment by the open door of the car and looked back in farewell to the devotees and the storefront temple. It was no longer a mere storefront, but had become something worthy. New Jagannath Puri. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati had asked him to come here. Who among his godbrothers could imagine how crazy these American hippies were, hallucinating on drugs, crying out, "I am God!" So many girls and boys, unhappy, mad, despite their wealth and education. But now, through Krishna consciousness, some were finding happiness. The first day he had arrived, the reporter had asked him why he had come to hate Ashbury. "Because the rent is cheap," he had replied. His desire was to spread the movement of Lord Chaitanya. Why else would he have come to such a dilapidated little storefront? To live next to a Chinese laundry and Digger's free store. The reporters had asked if he were inviting the hippies and bohemians to take to Krishna consciousness. Yes, he had said, everyone. But he had known that once joining him, his followers would become something different from what they had been before. Now the devotees were a family. If they followed his instructions, they would remain strong. If they were sincere, Krishna would help them. Lord Jagannath was present, and the devotees would have to worship him faithfully. They would be purified by chanting Hare Krishna and following their spiritual master's instructions. Prabhupada got into the car, accompanied by some of his disciples, and a devotee drove him to the airport. Several carloads of devotees followed behind. At the airport, the devotees were crying, but Prabhupada assured them he would return if they would hold a Rath Yatra festival. Quote, "You must arrange a procession down the main street," he told them. "Do it nicely. We must attract many people. They have such a procession yearly in Jagannath Puri. At this time, the deity may leave the temple." End quote. He would have to return, he knew, to tend the delicate devotional plants he had placed in their hearts. Otherwise, how could he expect these neophytes to survive in the ocean of material desires known as hate ashbury? Repeatedly he promised them he would return. He asked them to cooperate among themselves. Mukunda, Shyamasundar, Gurudas, Jayananda, Subala, Gaurasundar, Hayagriva, Haridas, and the girls. Only 2.5 months ago, he had arrived here at this very terminal, greeted by a throng of chanting young people. Many were now his disciples, although just barely assuming their spiritual identities and vows. Yet he felt no compunctions about leaving them. He knew that some of them might fall away, but he couldn't stay with them always. His time was limited. Srila Prabhupada, the father of 2 small bands of neophytes, tenderly left one group and headed east, where the other group was waiting in a different mood, a mood of joyful reception. And that's the end of this chapter. Does anybody have any thoughts or reflections after this part of the reading? Especially maybe any qualities of Srila Prabhupada or anything he said or did that particularly impressed you and could bring out any of his qualities.
Yes, like there was Govinda Dasi, one of his earliest disciples, has written like diaries about her time that she spent with Srila Prabhupada when the movement was very, very small. So there were just very few people and they were all living together and she was doing so much service, personal service. So they found like a centipede or something, an insect, a bug or something. So Prabhupada said, please chant to the poor creature. So she had written about how compassionate Prabhupada was even to a bug. So she has written very beautiful stuff. So it's nice to read and you can personally associate with Prabhupada. You'll get to know how Prabhupada was when the movement was really very small. Govinda Dasi's stories.
Thank you. Christopher, Prabhu?
Yes, Prabhu. It's interesting to see how Prabhupada, even though he was at this garden with all kind of trees and somewhere even like naked, but still he wasn't disturbed.
Yeah.
He would just carry on his duty, completely transcendental.
Yeah, thank you. Any other reflections? Sankirtan Priya Prabhu?
Krishna Guru, thank you for a very nice reading. Prabhupada, as he says towards the end of his this chapter, he planted these initial creepers in the hearts of devotees that hate Ashbury, and knowing full well that he'll have to return to nurture the creeper to grow further. In the meantime, cooperate with each other and do some self-nurturing, as it were, because obviously he had very limited time, and therefore he needed to travel around the world to ensure all of these creepers are growing at the same time, developing their Krishna consciousness. And we here at New Mayapur, we are trying to do. We have many volunteers here who come, and we try to nurture them in terms of their journey in Krishna consciousness. And Prabhupada, that's why he traveled around the world 14 times, as you can see why, because he needed to ensure that all of these creepers grew into nice, strong plants, or even at the ripe old age of 70 and 80, he was traveling at this pace. And so it's his magic and his tenacity and determination that actually grows this movement into a distribution. Continuously amongst us, this eternal presence, he continuously tries to do that even now.
That's very nice. Thank you. I was impressed similarly to Krishna, to what Christopher said. I was impressed with just how magnanimous Srila Prabhupada is. That he's going into so many places that many swamis would never even think of going, you know. And perhaps there would be, you know, persons who would criticize Prabhupada for going among such people. But we also see that, you know, in the pastimes of Lord Chaitanya, Lord Nityananda and Haridas Thakur, they would go even into the apparently lowest places in order to reach conditioned soul. And so Srila Prabhupada is continuing this mood that he doesn't have too much pretension to go anywhere, but he may be able to speak, share the Hare Krishna mantra with people, with living entities. So shall we begin to hear of Srila Prabhupada's return to New York City, to his other band of devotees? We'll read a little bit more. Okay. So now we're on chapter 25, entitled, Our Master Has Not Finished His Work. There was no warning that Srila Prabhupada's health would break down, or if there were, no one heeded it. As he moved from his devotees in San Francisco to his devotees in New York, no one passed any words that Swamiji should slow down. After the 5.5-hour jet flight, Prabhupada spoke of a quote-unquote blockading in his ears, but he seemed all right. He didn't rest, but went straight through the festive airport reception into 3 hours of strong lecturing and chanting in the storefront at 26 2nd Avenue. To his New York disciples, he appeared dazzling and lovable, and by his presence, his glances, and his words, he increased their Krishna consciousness. To them, his advanced age, now nearing 72 years, was but another of his transcendental features. He was their strength, and they never thought to consider his strength. In the temple, speaking from a new dais behind a velvet-covered lectern, Prabhupada said, "In my absence, things have improved." New paintings hung on the freshly painted white walls. Otherwise, it was the same tiny storefront where he had begun his International Society for Krishna Consciousness. He had written them that he wanted to enter the new building on his return, but they had failed, and they had foolishly lost $6,000. But without dwelling on this, Prabhupada made a more important observation. His disciples, despite the physical absence of their spiritual master, had made progress by following his instructions. As he sat looking happily at the freshly painted walls and the bright faces of his disciples, Prabhupada explained how one obtained expertise in Krishna consciousness by submissively following the spiritual master. He gave the example that although an engineer's apprentice may not be expert, if he turns a screw under the direct supervision of the expert engineer, he is acting as an expert. Many of the devotees were relieved to hear this. They knew that giving up material desires was difficult, and that they weren't going to become completely pure devotees overnight. Brahmananda had even written a poem stating that if, after many lifetimes, he could chant one round of the Hare Krishna mantra with attention, he would consider this the greatest success. But Prabhupada was explaining that even if they weren't expert in love of Krishna, if they worked under an expert, they were also acting as experts. The next morning, with the fanfare of Prabhupada's arrival past, it became apparent just how dependent the devotees were on their spiritual leader. The attendance was down to the dozen or so regulars, and Prabhupada silently entered the storefront and began to lead the chanting. But when the moment came for the devotees to sing in response, and Prabhupada heard their first chorus, he looked out to them, startled and compassionate. Now he could hear. They were weak, more like croaking than singing. They had deteriorated in his absence. The kirtans had changed while he had been away, and now he was hearing what the devotees were like, helpless souls croaking without joy or verve. Srila Prabhupada lectured from Chaitanya Charitamrita. Quote, when flying from San Francisco, I noticed that the plane was flying above an ocean of clouds. When I came from India by boat, I saw an ocean of water. And on the plane I saw an ocean of clouds, extending as far as you can see. Above the clouds is the sun, but when we come down through the clouds and land, everything in New York is dim and clouded, but the sun is still shining. Those clouds cannot cover the whole world. They cannot even cover the whole United States, which is no more than a speck in the universe. From an airplane we can see skyscrapers as very tiny. Similarly, from God's position, all this material nonsense is insignificant. As a living entity, I am very insignificant, and my tendency is to come down. But the sun doesn't have the come down tendency. It is always above the clouds of Maya. End quote. A new boy raised his hand. Why is it that one person, one soul, comes to Krishna and another doesn't? Prabhupada replied with another question. Why is one soul in the Bowery and another has come to the Krishna temple? He paused, but no one could reply. Because one wants to be here and the other doesn't, he explained. It is a question of free will. If we use it properly, we can go to Krishna. Otherwise, we will stay down in the material world. Everyone had something to ask Swamiji. Throughout the day, devotees would be in and out of his room, asking practical and philosophical questions, and they took up their old ways of reciprocating with him. Once again, Prabhupada was telling Achyutananda what to cook for lunch, and explaining to him that an expert servant learns to anticipate what the master wants, even before he asks for it. Satsvarup came in to show Prabhupada the last typed manuscripts for teachings of Lord Chaitanya. Although there was no difference in Satsvarup's assignment, now that he was face to face with Prabhupada, he realized he had to type and edit more seriously. He asked whether he could resign from his job at the welfare office. Prabhupada said no. Jadurani continued painting in the outer room of Prabhupada's apartment. Casting shyness aside, she asked him many questions about how to paint Krishna. How is Lord Vishnu situated in the heart, she asked. Is he sitting, or standing, or what? Prabhupada replied, oh, for that you have to meditate for thousands of years. Jadurani stared at him in dismay. Then Prabhupada said, he is standing. And she went off happily to paint. When Jadurani complained of weak health, Prabhupada asked Achyutananda to see that she got milk twice a day. Looking through the window that opened into the outer room, where typing, painting, and sometimes even construction went on, Prabhupada watched Jadurani one day as she worked on a painting of the Lord Chaitanya's Sankirtan party. Just as she started to paint the words of the Maha Mantra across the bottom of the painting, Prabhupada called through the window, don't put the Maha Mantra there. But you told me to put it there, she said. I've changed my mind. Hare Krishna should not be below Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. One by one, Prabhupada saw all his old New York followers. Gargamuni, the temple treasurer, who reported good sales of the Hare Krishna record and incense. Rai Ram, editor of Bhakti Godhead, who talked about his indigestion. And Rupanuga, who had a good job, but was having difficulty convincing his wife about Krishna consciousness. Even Mr. Chuti, the landlord, dropped by with complaints about the boy's behavior. Prabhupada also met Michael Bloomert, a newcomer. Michael had been seeing a psychiatrist as a result of devastating drug experiences. When he had begun coming to the temple, his mother and father had thought the Swamiji another evil force. On meeting Swamiji, however, Mrs. Bloomert accepted his authenticity, although her husband remained doubtful. Mr. Bloomert, Srila Prabhupada said, your wife is more intelligent. Mr. Bloomert said he wanted his son to help the world in a more practical way, by becoming a doctor. Prabhupada argued that there were already so many doctors, but people still were suffering. A Krishna-conscious person, however, could relieve a person's suffering completely. So the work of Krishna consciousness was more valuable. Mr. Bloomert was unconvinced, but he agreed to let Michael stay with the devotees and drop going to the psychiatrist. He came to respect the Swami, even though disagreeing with him. With Brahmananda, Prabhupada discussed the urgent problem of obtaining a permanent visa. Prabhupada had repeatedly extended his visa ever since he had entered the country in 1965. Now, immigration officials denied him any further extensions. He didn't want to leave the US, but the only way he would be able to stay would be to get a permanent residency. He had applied, but so far with no success. Your government doesn't want me to stay, he had said, so I may have to go back to India. Swamiji's going back to India was a frightening prospect. His disciples had barely been able to accept that he could leave them for preaching elsewhere in the US. If he were to go back to India, they feared they might fall back into the material world. He was sustaining their spiritual life. How could they go on without him? And Prabhupada felt the same way. Brahmananda managed to find a lawyer to delay the proceedings of the immigration office. The threat of deportation passed. Prabhupada spoke of going to Montreal and getting permanent residency there, but his main intention was to stay in America and cultivate what he had begun. Brahmananda reported to Prabhupada about printing the Bhagavad Gita. The manuscript was ready, and they were considering the costs and where to print it, even though they didn't have enough money to publish the book themselves. They hadn't seriously attempted the arduous process of finding a publisher, but Prabhupada pushed Brahmananda to do so. The only hope is that I have my books, Prabhupada said. Brahmananda also talked with Prabhupada about the $6,000 he had lost to Mr. Price. Prabhupada insisted that they prosecute the culprits. He sent Brahmananda to speak with various lawyers and also to tell Mr. Price and Mr. Tyler that, quote, His Excellency was back and would take them to court. At that, they relented. Mr. Tyler refunded most of the $5,000 deposit, and Mr. Price returned $750 of the $1,000 he had wheeled out of Brahmananda. The legal services had cost more than $1,000, so that was lost. But Prabhupada said that when dealing with a tiger, you can expect to get scratched. In a letter to Kirtanananda in Montreal, Prabhupada described the successful termination of the Price affair. You will be glad to know that I have been able, by grace of Krishna, to recover $4,227 out of the $5,000 gone in the belly of Sir Conman Fraud, which is Mr. Price. Okay, so there's just a few minutes left in the class, so why don't we take any further reflections or thoughts or anything you heard that you'd just like to repeat or reflect back. Thank you, Prabhu.
It's nice to see how Srila Prabhupada is so determined. He doesn't say, okay, well, we've lost something, that's it, let's just move on and forget about it, let's not fight. He's determined that no matter what, people want to cheat us out of our things, what is right, what is wrong, and what was the condition of the present time, place and circumstance. He knew the law of the land wherever he was. Even with the Juhu story, with the temple in Juhu, the temple in Vrindavan, the temple in Mayapur, all these different places, he knew the land, the law of the land. Right? So he knew how to deal with things.
Yeah. And it's interesting to hear how he wasn't just passive about it, because you might think like, well, that's Krishna's will, and we shouldn't try to counteract, material reversals. So it's interesting because sometimes it's a little difficult for devotees to tell, like, if they're facing some obstacles, should I take this as Krishna's sign that he doesn't want me to pursue this any further, or is Krishna testing my determination and I should keep going further? But we notice that advanced devotees, and especially Srila Prabhupada, it's like they just know when to go forward and when to sort of like, okay, just kind of give peace to that situation. Christopher Prabhu, you had your hand up?
Yes, Prabhu. It's interesting to see, just by reading Shantatma and Lilamrita, we can really go inside what happened. And we can see that Prabhupada, just by being present, he would awaken people Krishna consciousness only by his presence. So
Yeah. Thank you.
everything just because of his Krishna consciousness, then he, just by following the instructions of the parampara, then Krishna will foresee everything. He has a complete faith. Like I did not say it before, in the previous chapter he repeatedly said, just go on chanting to that boy where he was invited. And also he started just chanting when the crowd was starting to boo. And it refers also to the poem he wrote, that I don't have nothing, but I just have complete faith. Just before he arrived when he was on the boat, I have just complete faith. Pure desire.
Yeah, it was quite amazing to hear how after he left that Morning Star Ranch, where he had just come for a short time, chanted and maybe spoke to a few people, that there was those who, living at that ranch, they kept up the chanting of Hare Krishna, and then some of them took it up so seriously that they stopped doing drugs. And this was just from a short visit by Srila Prabhupada. So just this Krishna consciousness just infecting them in a good way. Are there any other last reflections?
Because I was remembering Srila Prabhupada passed on this quality of saving money and being very frugal to his disciples. Because Jayananda Thakur, like he was also like very particular, we shouldn't waste even a single penny when it comes to Krishna's money. And Jayananda used to actually, they used to hire some kind of machine or something to do the thrash, so instead of hiring the machine, Jayananda used to jump on the thrash to push it down, something like that. Even for like smallest things, Jayananda was like trying to save every penny that belongs to Krishna. Which is like a lesson for us. We shouldn't allow others to cheat us of our money. Even though we are running a temple, we still have to be very judicious when it comes to Lakshmi.
Yeah. Thank you. Anything else? Yes, Prabhu?
Yeah, Prabhu, I really liked how Srila Prabhupada was really reflective and self-reflective in the sense that how he said that initially he had instructed one of his disciples to paint the Maha Mantra underneath Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, but then he reflected on that and said that he changed his mind. And how important it is for us to also be reflective in our own spiritual lives and to think about things deeply, and so then we can adapt. And yeah.
That's a really nice point. so you got Christopher, one last thing?
Just one last thing, Prabhupada said to Brahmananda, the only hope is that I have my books.
The only hope is that I have my books. Yeah.
So, there are different meanings, but it's so important to get in touch with Srila Prabhupada's books. Everything comes from...
Yeah, our only hope also is that we have his books, right? Our only hope also is that we have his books.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. It was wonderful doing some hearing and chanting with all of you. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.
Great Shantatma Prabhu ki
Gaura Bhakta Vrinda ki jai.